Hiya. So this is the third video. I'm going to try my very, very best to stay under 10 minutes for this one, but we'll see. And this is on scene 3, which is the poker night, and it's one of the most famous scenes in the play for lots of reasons. In fact, Williams was going to call this play the poker night, so he saw this scene as being very important. And this is the scene where we see the conflict break from verbal to physical. Just very briefly, in terms of a summary to start with, the men are playing poker. Stanley and his 3 friends. Blanche and Stella have been out to Galatoire's, the restaurant from earlier, and they arrive at 2:30 in the morning. The poker game's still going on, and because the place is so small, Blanche and Stella go behind the curtain, and the men continue playing poker. Mitch then comes out to the bathroom and has this conversation with Blanche where they kind of start to get to know each other a bit, and there's a bit of attraction between the two of them. And then Stanley gets angry and hits Stella, and Stella runs upstairs to Eunice and locks herself in. The men try and sober Stanley up by putting him in the shower, and then Stanley does the really famous scene in the play where he shouts Stella's name from the bottom of the balcony, eventually, so that she comes down and goes back into the apartment with him, while Blanche stays upstairs with Eunice. So that's kind of the drama of scene 3. We see the conflicts that have been brewing in scenes 1 and 2 kind of really kind of explode in this scene. So it's worth looking at where that conflict comes from. That's the next thing that we can do. I think straight away in scene 3, during the poker night, Williams establishes that Stanley is angry even when he's having fun with his friends. So Stanley is losing the game of poker, which is quite a kind of big reason why you can see him get wound up. So even at the start, the way he talks to Steve and Pablo and Mitch, look at the language that he uses. When I'm losing, you want to eat. Ante up, openers, get off the table, Mitch. Then he says, shut up to Mitch. Oh, for God's sake, go home then. He makes fun of Mitch, hurry back and we'll fix you a sugar tit. Almost everything Stanley says is kind of an insult or a command to these other people. It's partly because he's drunk, I think. It's partly because he's losing, and it's also just partly because in any room Stanley has to feel in control. He has to feel like he's the one in charge. So you can see that the way he speaks to the women in scenes 1 and 2, he speaks like that to everybody. He speaks like that to his friends as well. So you can see Stanley starting to get annoyed straight away. That's one of the sources of conflict. Another source of conflict then is the fact that Blanche and Stella come home. Stella suggests that they should finish the game, and Stanley doesn't like that idea. He wants to carry on playing poker with his friends. So they have to go behind a curtain, and then Stanley gets annoyed that they're making too much noise and distracting him. And then Mitch goes and is distracted by Blanche, so he kind of feels that the poker game has been ruined for lots and lots of reasons. And the last straw for Stanley is when Blanche turns the radio on, and he gets up and throws the radio out of the window and smashes it up. And Stella then understandably gets angry, and then Stanley gets even angrier and hits her. That's where we're going with that. So in this scene, it's actually, in terms of dialogue, probably a shorter scene than the previous ones before. So that might give me a chance to clock in at under 10 minutes here, because actually the dialogue is much quicker and shorter. That's one of the big patterns to look for in this scene. This idea of short, fast dialogue, lots of very short sentences. They're all drunk and they're all kind of heightened emotions, even Stella and Blanche slightly. So there's loads and loads of kind of minor sentences to start with to establish this idea that everybody's just kind of a bit drunk and inarticulate and angry. And especially with Stanley, there's lots of really short sentences. So that's something to look at in terms of patterns. If we have a look at kind of a little bit later on, if we have a look at the moment where Stanley kind of gets angry. That's a little bit later on in the scene. It's on page 35. She turns the radio on, and Stanley, again, look at the verbs in the stage directions on page 35. Look at the contrast that Williams is providing on stage. Blanche waltzes to the music with romantic gestures. Look at that verb, waltzes. Mitch is delighted and moves in awkward imitation like a dancing bear. So you've got that simile there. But Mitch is just having some innocent fun as well. He's dancing. And then Stanley stalks fiercely through the portieres. He crosses to the small white radio and snatches it off the table. With a shouted oath, he tosses the instrument out of the window. Look again at the difference there, how Williams is presenting that conflict and that violence. Stalks, crosses, snatches, and tosses it out the window. Stella, as we've talked about before, Stella does give back aggression when Stanley pushes her. So Stella shouts at Stanley, drunk animal thing you. She rushes through to the poker table. All of you please go home. If any of you have one spark of decency in you. Again, it's really important not to present Stella as this kind of weak character. She isn't weak. She does kind of fight back to Stanley, but unfortunately Stanley then kind of hits her, doesn't he? So Stanley resorts to that ultimate show of male dominance over her and hits her. But Stella is not afraid of him. Drunk animal thing you. Look at the symbolism there. We're gonna see that cropping up now, of Stanley being an animal. If you look at the stage directions, even words like stalks, he stalks across the room. Williams uses the word stalks for Stanley quite a lot, and again, it's this idea that Stanley is presented as this kind of animal, as opposed to Blanche especially, but also Stella as being more kind of refined and more kind of human. That's something that we're going to see later on, and it's something that's a big source of conflict between them, that Stanley is this animal, and it again goes back to what we were saying or what I was saying in scene 1, which is that it's a play about class. It's a play about two very different types of people. So drunk animal thing is quite important that Stella says that, because that is something that's going to become a metaphor later on. In terms of conflict, if you just have a look at page 35 and 36, where he hits her, it does become this really fragmented, really fast, short sentence kind of scene. Everybody is using exclamatives because everybody's shouting across each other. The men, Blanche, Stella, everybody is using exclamatives, and everybody is using these short, shouted kind of dialogue lines. So that's one really obvious way in which Williams presents open, violent conflict, through those exclamatives and those short sentences. And then a kind of almost unexpected thing happens after the violence. The men put Stanley in the shower, and then the men leave because he says, "Let go of me, you sons of bitches," and sounds of blows are heard. So he kind of punches the men, so they run off. And then Stanley starts crying, which we might find a bit unexpected after the violence and the kind of show of masculine dominance. Stanley sobs on page 37. He breaks into sobs. Then he goes to the phone and dials, still shuddering with sobs. He becomes this kind of pathetic, kind of vulnerable character. And then you get the famous scene where he's shouting Stella. She's upstairs, and he comes out and shouts up, "Stella, Stella, Stella." You get Eunice shouting him down, "Quit that howling out there and go back to bed." On page 37, look at that word again, howling. Quit that howling out there. So Stanley again is kind of metaphorically presented as an animal. "You stinker, you whelp of a Polak," on page 38. A whelp is kind of another word for kind of a kind of young animal. So a whelp is again this idea that Stanley is an animal, and he shouts Stella with heaven-splitting violence. This whole moment is a symbol, and I think there's a couple of things going on. Think about what Williams is doing with a balcony scene here. Quite brave, isn't it, in your play, if you're writing a play in the 20th century, to put a balcony scene in there, because people are going to go to one of the most famous plays ever written Romeo and Juliet, and they're going to make comparisons. I think that's exactly what Williams wants. He wants this to be a kind of dark, twisted love story, doesn't it? A twisted version of Romeo and Juliet. He knows exactly what he's doing when he puts a balcony scene between two lovers in this play, because it does hark back to that iconic balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. But this is kind of much less kind of romantic, isn't it? And this is kind of the culmination of a kind of horrible act of abuse where a husband has hit his pregnant wife. It's kind of not romantic at all, is it? So you get this scene is really strange because it's presented in some ways as being romantic, but in other ways as being kind of really kind of sickening and dark. And you've got to decide really whether you think Williams is treading that line of is he glamorizing this, or is he just kind of presenting it to us. And the second thing again is the symbolism of class. It's again not a coincidence that what Stanley does in this scene is he pulls Stella down. Think about that metaphor. Stella is up high and Stanley's down low, and he shouts Stella and he pulls her down to his level. Think about that as a metaphor for their relationship. Stanley alludes to it later on, he talks about it later on, so again that's a metaphor that Williams picks up, that he pulls her down from a high place. And if you think about that in terms of class, that is what he's done by marrying into a richer family. So hopefully there are a few things there. I'll do my post-it thing. I don't think that I wrote any new ones, so I've got some of the same ones from before. The biggest here, we've got use of symbolism and metaphor. Obviously the idea of the balcony, the idea of the animal metaphor, that sort of thing. The use of exclamatory sentences, and I'll add kind of fragmented sentences to that as well. The use of fragmented minor exclamatory sentences in this scene is really important because it's a scene of action, isn't it? It's a scene where lots of action happens, lots of shouting. It's not a scene of kind of calm dialogue really. So you've got lots of exclamatories, lots of shouting. And as always, the use of dynamic verbs in the stage directions, really important for Stanley again, isn't it? Because we get his act of violence there. So that's scene 3. Hopefully that made sense. Thank you.